we know that by reason of their disobedience, that generation that was led out of Egypt was to wander for 40 years and to ultimately die in the wilderness. It was the next generation, led by Joshua and Caleb, that would cross the river Jordan and ultimately conquer the land and to occupy the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In this record, we also know that as we go through the Exodus record and Deuteronomy and Numbers, we have the giving of the law. We have the precise instructions, or the instructions and guide, on the construction of the tabernacle. We have the detail of various events in the wilderness, both with the people and also in terms of, again, the things and the institutions and the feasts that were put in place while they were in the wilderness. And all of this is designed to give us insight, not only into the mind of God, but also into the mind of the people and how they were kind of addressing and dealing with things. And so I think because of that, we obviously find it easy, and obviously Scripture has guided us this way, to make that direct association with the symbol of the wilderness to that of our own walk in the truth. The fact that we are sojourners in this land, and that we do truly in this dispensation walk through a wilderness. And we also then, in this day and age, know that we as Gentiles, we're called to also be redeemed from sin. And certainly for the generations that have lived before us since the time of our Master, the Lord Jesus Christ, they have also died in the wilderness, but they have also died with a hope of a future resurrection and eternal life in the kingdom of God. And so we too are in a symbolic wilderness. We're being proved and we're being tested to see if we also will be developed into vessels, either of dishonor or of honor. So the challenge is how do we translate these lessons and observations of the wilderness wanderings of the Israelites to our own lives? How do we take what we understand about ourselves and our nature, and we obviously touched a little bit, and when we read about what Paul reflected on himself in Romans chapter 7, to further our development to be pleasing servants and followers and disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ. So what I hope to accomplish in the next few classes is to consider practical applications of how we can better manifest God's glory, how we can hopefully better prepare ourselves for a place in the kingdom of God, God willing. So to reflect on what we continue, part of what I've done is to reflect on how we learn more about ourselves, even in this modern era, as we consider how people think and how they react and how they do things, and take that and realize that at the end of the day, there's nothing new under the sun. Whatever we read or whatever we sort of discover in this day and age, God has already understood our nature, and he's already put in ways for us to be able to serve him. And so hopefully this is just a way of emphasizing or reflecting what is already in Scripture before us, and again, applying it to our own lives. So when I considered the theme, our own walk in the wilderness, I broke it down in these 4 ways. I looked at class 1 as that constant exercise and commitment we must take and apply in our lives each and every day to put away the old man. Class 2 is a reflection on how important it is to have that guide to our conscience to make right and wrong decisions as we go through our daily lives. Because we're always being faced with some sort of decision making as we go through at work or at school or at home. And it's that guide to our conscience that we want to take some time to consider. Class 3 is a consideration of how trust is developed and exemplified. It's really trusting in Yahweh, trusting in the Lord in a way that becomes just part of the way that we live our lives. And how, again, can we build that up, and how can we emphasize these things? Class 4 is the power of vision. And again, it's impact on our behavior, impact on our walk, being motivated by vision. And so we will take some time to reflect on how we can best apply that and do that. And finally, we'll wrap up with an exhortation. It turns out that I actually have an exhortation, I think, the following week after this series of classes, so it'll kind of hopefully dovetail into these things. And it really is then stepping back and looking at what we've considered in the classes and have an appreciation for He who has walked before us. For indeed, the Lord Jesus Christ bore our nature and has experienced all the things that we're going to consider in the next couple of weeks, God willing. Now, you will immediately note, and I'm sure our brother Mike is wondering, how is he going to fit 4 classes into 3? Because there was only 3 planned for the syllabus, and of course we have 4 classes that I've put up on the board here. Well, at the beginning, to be honest with you, this is, and maybe I should confess this is the first time I've actually done a series and a class, and so when I put myself forward to volunteer to fill a slot in the Sunday school schedule, Mike said, well, how many classes do you think you can do? So I was thinking of this subject for quite a while, and I thought, well, I think it's 3. I think we could put it into 3. And it was only when I began to put pen to paper, when I started to develop this and work on it as we came up to this date, I realized that actually 4 was probably a more appropriate segmentation. So I had the option of either going to Brother Mike and saying if he wanted to extend Sunday school by 1 additional week, or in this case, I'm actually just going to take classes 2 and 3 and kind of merge them together. Although, going forward, I'd like to fully develop them as self-standing classes. But ultimately, we will cover all 4 topics, and God willing, if the Lord remains away, we'll take an opportunity to look at the exhortation as well. And so the first class then is this idea of putting away the old man. Well, we will remember then that the ultimate salvation from the Egyptians was when the people of Israel passed through the Red Sea on dry ground. And it was when they turned and looked and realized that the waters were returning back and literally burying the Egyptians and all that they represent in the waters of the Red Sea. So the Israelites at that point on the other side of the shores were now given a new start. Very, literally and figuratively. And the obvious connection to baptism is obvious. And it's echoed. And we see that in what Paul wrote to the Corinthians when he says, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And that's in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 2. And so truly there was a baptism. There was a baptism into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And in like manner, we also were baptized, or many of us have accepted the call of the gospel and have made that decision to be baptized and to commit our lives. And we know that when we also went into those waters of baptism, we buried Egypt. We buried those past sins, and we had a new start and a new beginning in our lives. We truly crucified the old man, and we rose to be new men and new women, brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus Christ, and that henceforth we should not serve sin. And yet, that is the problem, isn't it? Our nature is still with us. We still sin. We live our lives with very much the sentiments that we reflected on in our opening reading. Taking it from the ESV version, Paul reflected in verse 19 of Romans 7, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I would not do is what I keep on doing." And that is so much the case, I think, for many of us in our lives. So in Exodus 15:22, and we're going to start there. We're actually going to spend a lot of time kind of just going back and forth between Exodus and Numbers and pulling out different passages. But in Exodus 15, in verse 22, it says that Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. So this really was the very first time that the people were being tested and proved. And in this situation, the people experienced thirst. And so it says that they did begin to murmur against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So was this sin? They certainly were being ungrateful. I think we'll take some time and consider the issues they might have in trusting Yahweh and trusting in his provisions, but we'll save that for another class. But what we also have is the beginning of a pattern that we will see as we go along, and we're going to take a chunk of time to kind of establish this pattern. But the reality of it is that this is only 3 days after their baptism. After visibly seeing their salvation from Egypt, seeing their salvation from sin and all it represents, after 3 days, the people grumbled and complained at what was happening, this new walk that they were having before their God. I think it's a sober reflection. How long was it before we sinned after our baptism? Was it 3 days? Was it 3 weeks? Or maybe 3 hours? Or only 3 minutes? The reality is that our fleshly tendencies do not go away just because we made that commitment to be baptized. All of us throughout our lives, both before our baptism and unfortunately after, have developed habitual responses to situations. We have a nature that has a propensity to react to things in a certain way. Some are good habits, just our nature is such to establish habitual patterns and behaviors, but some are bad. We are wired to develop habits. And many times it's because it actually frees us up to pay attention to other things, that we can, in a sense, multitask by habitual behaviors. Real easy ones are the fact that I don't think anyone's pay any attention to how we brush our teeth. We've done it so many times in so many ways, they probably, if you really thought about it, there's a certain pattern and regimen that you have when it comes to brushing your teeth. Or perhaps when you get dressed. Or when you drive to work, you drive the same way in the same pattern, you leave at the same time, and these are all done automatically because we've developed this habit to accomplish this task without having to pay much thought to it. Some habits are responses to certain stimuli, that we react a certain way when we're criticized, or when we're under pressure, or lately, as I've sort of termed it, when we're hangry. We get that irritability when we've decided to eat too late and we're hungry. For the people of Israel, we're going to see the following situations. That God put situations in front of the Israelites to test them. As it says in Deuteronomy verse 8, and if you want, you can turn the two here if you want, or just make a note of it. But in Deuteronomy chapter 8, in verse 2, it says, "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee, and to prove thee, or to test thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no." And so, as we see in these times of testing, we see that there's certain habitual responses. And it's always a mind that casts back and goes back to Egypt. Those good old days of Egypt. The old man and the old life that we have a fondness for and we reflect on. And so let's walk through how these situations create certain emotions, certain reactions in the people of Israel. And again, that consistency of response. And so the first one is fear. And actually, I chose this one because it's a demonstration that this reaction that they have is the same reaction before their baptism through the Red Sea and after. Because in Exodus 14, if we come in at verse 9 and 10, it says that the Egyptians pursued after the Israelites. This is after they've left Egypt, and all the horses and the chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army overtook them, encamping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth and before Baal-zephon. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried out unto the Lord. And so what's the reaction? How are they going to react to this imminent danger of Pharaoh coming after them? Well, unfortunately, we see the pattern in verse 12. Is this not the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone? This is the people of Israel speaking to Moses. Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians, that we should die in the wilderness. So yet, even not having yet entered going through those waters, we see that they are already thinking it would be better to be in Egypt. And that's a response to their fear. The other one is thirst, and that was the one that we actually just noted, just in the next chapter, in chapter 15. Now here, there's no specific reference to the people recalling or having a fondness for Egypt. But we definitely see that there's this murmuring that happens. And I don't think it's hard to imagine how returning to Egypt again would be the sentiment. There would have been water in Egypt, and there was no water here. But what we also see, and what gives us a hint that, yes, they were still thinking of Egypt, was how God, in verse 26, establishes an ordinance and a statute. And he puts it this way. He says that there would be an ordinance and a statute, or statute and ordinance, for there he proved them. That's in verse 25. And in verse 26, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians. For I am the Lord that heal thee. And we will look closer. We'll actually come back to this section in a later class to look at the statute and the ordinances that were put in place at this time. The other situation is one of hunger. And again, in Exodus 16, coming in at verse 3, it says, the children of Israel said, would to God we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we did eat bread to the full. And what's their complaint? For you have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. So when they were hungry, just as they were when they were thirsty, even when they even lead the expression of their disappointment with a reflection of the fond memories of when we ate bread to the full, when we sat by the flesh pots. The irony there that came to my mind is that's probably what they were doing. They were sitting beside it. They couldn't eat it because that was for the Egyptians. For them, they probably had something less enticing. But they're painting this picture of what it was like to be in Egypt. The other one is idleness, and the situation of idleness. And this is a tragic event, and if anything, it emphasizes just how badly things can get when we sit around having nothing to do. I think there's obviously many ways that we could look at the situation of the golden calf, but to me, I think the root of it all is idleness. That they had nothing to do but to wait for Moses. In verse 1 it says, and when the people saw that Moses delayed, it's been a long time to come down out of the mount, and the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and said unto him, up, make us gods, which shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. It's been too long. We've got nothing to do but to wait for Moses, nothing to occupy our mind. And the tragic part of it all is we see in verse 4, he received them at their hand and fashioned the gold with a graven tool, and he made it a molten calf. And they said, the people of Israel said, well, these be our gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. How twisted it had become that they were now considering that it was these false gods, this idol that was going to be the one that ultimately had taken them out of Egypt and brought them out of Egypt. I think this is a tragic consequence of trying to integrate and accommodate the world into our ecclesia. We have to go to Numbers, actually for the next one, Numbers 11. and coming in at verse 6, where it's lust. I mean, it's very much the lust of the flesh. He says in verse 6, "For now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes." I mean, here, instead of being grateful for God's provision, all they could see is that day after day after day, they were being fed the same things. They were tired of the same old food, and they lusted for what they saw in Egypt. In fact, again, they preceded this complaint with the echoing of that fondness for Egypt. In verse 5, it says, "We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlics." Envy is made apparent in chapter 12 of Numbers. And it's preceded, obviously, by Moses marrying the Ethiopian woman. And Miriam and Aaron come up and say in verse 2, "Hath the Lord indeed spoken only by Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us?" And the Lord heard it. Again, there's not a mention of Egypt specifically, but it's a natural reaction just the same, using the marriage of Moses to suggest that they also were worthy of the Lord's attention, that they also should be put in that position of power and authority. I mean, we could argue it's maybe pride, but we'll actually look at another example of that. But I think it's envy. When you see somebody that you think you're just as worthy of, and you're envious of the position that they're in. If we go to Numbers 14, verse 4, we see rebellion. And again, the people, when they had seen the giants in Numbers 13, they'd sent the spies into the land, and of course the reaction was they saw these giants before them, but only Caleb and Joshua said, "The Lord is with us, and there's no reason why we can't go in and take the land." It was that test of faith, but instead of trusting in the Lord their God, they rebelled and they wanted a new captain. And what did they want this new captain to do? Well, in verse 4, it says, "They said one to another, 'Let us make us a captain, and let us return into Egypt.'" Again, when we have these moments where we succumb to the flesh is a powerful draw and attraction that wants to lead us away. And so the people again found themselves wanting to return back to that old life, to not put away the old man, and to bring them back. And then finally we have pride, and that's we see in Numbers 16. And again, a very familiar story, but Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And it says that in verse 2, "They rose up before Moses with certain of the children of Israel, 250 princes of the assembly, famous in the congregation, men of renown." So they had gathered themselves together, men that were famous, men of reputation, proud men who felt that they were more than qualified to take on a leadership role of the people of Israel. And look at the perspective that they bring in verse 13. First of all, actually, let's look at verse 12 for context. "And Moses sent to call Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, which said, 'We will not come up.' And why is that? Well, in verse 13, 'Is it a small thing that thou, Moses, hast brought us up out of a land that floweth with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness, except thou make thyself altogether a prince over us?'" It's just so twisted that they would take the very promise of God to lead them to a land of milk and honey and suggest that that's not it. The one that we just left is the one that's the land flowing with milk and honey. So virtually every test that we see, fear, thirst, hunger, idleness, lust, envy, rebellion, and pride, their default reaction was to go back to Egypt, to think with the carnal mind, to appeal to their sin-prone nature. Are we any different? Unfortunately not. We encounter situations not dissimilar. We have these same kind of reactions, and this probably is obviously not an exhaustive list. But what I find is recognizing these things is one thing. That's one step, to recognize that we have these propensities and these things that come into our minds and into our lives. But how to overcome them is yet another. Well, the Apostle James in his letter broke down the steps that lead to sin. In the epistle to James in chapter 1, he says, "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. And when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And when it is finished, it bringeth forth death." Well, there was recently published in a book. It was called Atomic Habits by James Clear, a model of how the habits work. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this class, however, there is nothing new under the sun. This thought leadership that's very popular today mirrors very much what was already elucidated by the Apostle James. Basically, what it says in this book is that habits are formed and reinforced in a continuous loop. The thing is, our brain goes through these steps all the time, and what these steps are is that everything starts with a cue, or what they call a cue. It's a sight, it's a smell, it's an emotion, it's something that creates a cue or a trigger. It's something that triggers in your brain, something that gets it all started. And it's followed by that craving, the desire to satisfy whatever that cue started. It causes us to want to react in a certain way. It's the motivational force or desire that occurs within us. And then that is followed up by the response. It's what we actually do as a result of the cue and the craving. It's the habit response. And lastly, then, is the perceived reward, or the reward when we actually do satisfy that desire. We can either decide to say, this is worth repeating because it gives me the reward I'm looking for, or perhaps it's a bad experience, you wouldn't do it again. But the whole point of habits is that we see a benefit as a result of responding in a certain way, and it reinforces that behavior. And so what's interesting is when we line up the epistle of James in 1 verse 35 with this habit loop of cue, craving, response, and reward, the Apostle James sees it this way. He says, well, the cue is when we're drawn away. The craving is when lust is conceived. And the response is when we sin. But for James, it was clear what the reward was and what the reward is. The reward of sin is death, as we see in Romans 6. And so we could line this up, and just for the perspective of keeping it consistent, but we could put any one of these examples. But this happens to be the first one that we encounter after they've been baptized and after they come into the wilderness, is this cue of there's something that made them thirsty. There was something that happened. Maybe it was just literally the fact that they were 3 days in the wilderness. But it is the first recorded time of their test and their temptation. And their craving then is thirst. They are looking for something to drink. But their response, their habitual responses that we saw so many times, was to go back to Egypt. That was going to be the place where their thirst could be satiated. For the Israelites in Exodus 15, something prompted the thirst. It somehow seems to be related, or it would be related to the waters of Marah, but I think that there's something deeper to this, because it just seems so dramatic that they would murmur and express their dissatisfaction in such a way. I think it was in part that they saw the waters of Marah, and they had an expectation that as Moses had led them out of the wilderness, had God has redeemed them out of the waters of the Red Sea, that this would be the best tasting water that they've ever experienced in their entire life, and it was bitter. Their answer was to return back to Egypt. They ran into a little bit of a roadblock, and they immediately wanted to go back to Egypt. Their craving had motivated the response. Their habit was to go back. They could not think of another way that they could have gotten fresh water, that their thirst could be satisfied. In their mind, Egypt held the preferred reward, and the inclination is that every time they're tried, they want to return to Egypt. Unfortunately, they did not see it as a reward of death, as the Apostle James had put it, but rather that thirst could be satiated by Egypt. We see plenty of habits in today's world. We have plenty of habits in our own life, and they're mundane, like brushing your teeth, or they can be beneficial, or they can be potentially damaging. As an example of a conditioned response in this current day and age, I've put smartphone up on the screen. The cue is when your phone buzzes with a text message. And as I was sitting there, I couldn't help it. I got a buzz on my phone, and they immediately pulled it out, and I realized, gee, our brother's presiding from the platform. It's terrible. Now, it turns out I thought there was maybe something wrong with the video feed, so I wanted to make sure it wasn't Brother Vaughn telling me that he couldn't see what was going on. But it's a response that we've all experienced. The phone buzzes, and our craving is we want to know what's being said, what's being communicated to us. And so our response is we grab the phone, and of course our reward is we get to know the content of the message. Sometimes it's disappointing, other times it's not. The problem is that the habit is that every time the phone buzzes, we pick it up. The problem is it's any time. It's mid-conversation. It's anywhere. We see people do it. I do it. And sometimes we're not even aware that we're doing it. Now, in this case, it's so automatic, it doesn't lead to death unless you happen to be driving, perhaps. But it does demonstrate how easy a habit can form. Not every habit is bad. When an alarm goes off, I crave coffee. And the first thing I do is I go downstairs and I make coffee and I bring it back up to bed. My reward is I get that hit of caffeine, and so my habit is that every time the alarm goes off, I go to the coffee machine. It's pretty much an automatic response every time. The problem with habits, as the Epistle James had pointed out, is that when we're drawn away to sin, and so we have some old habits that were before we were baptized, and we've formed new ones since. And so let's take a moment. What habits do we have that lead to sin? I want you to think about this, and I only want you to pick out one. This is part of the workshop exercise. Just pick one. The other problem we have is we like to boil the ocean. I might have 10 that I need to deal with, and I'll try to deal with them all at the same time because I want to prevent them all. But at the end of the day, for the purpose of focus, we'll pick one. In fact, you might even want to write this down. And I encourage you to write it down. It may be uncomfortable. There's certain things that we know about ourselves that we'd much rather not other people know. And this isn't for sharing. This is your own personal reflection, and you can put it in your own personal journal. But when you write something down, it makes it more real. It can make it more important. And so write it down. What habits do we have that lead to sin? I heard a brother counsel young people just actually a few months, or maybe a few months ago. He says, be careful what you put in your mind because it never leaves you. And that may be just one of the cues that happen in your life that draw us away, that cause us to crave and conceive lust and lead us to sin. But there is another side to the coin. What good habits would we like to develop? Many of us have something we'd like to do more of a good habit. It could be doing our Bible readings more consistently. It could be praying more often. It could be just being grateful more often or thinking of others. There's always ways that we can improve, that we can develop good habits. Some things that we just want to just do better. And it could be spiritual, or it could be just wanting to eat better. Like eating more fruit, more vegetables, more butter tarts, more steak. Well, maybe not the last two. It could be just getting more exercise. But we want to take a moment and reflect and think of something that we can do to make a good habit, something that we would like to do more of that for some reason we're not able to do it or we're not consistent in doing it. Again, I encourage you to write it down. And only one. We want to be able to focus on one good practice and make it a habit, something that we want to do just about every day. And when we don't, it feels like we're missing. And so how do we put away the old man? So for these Sunday school classes, as I've said, I want to make them practical. I'm going to share some perspectives and some techniques that have worked for me, or at least I've tried because someone else has suggested that they could work based on their experiences. But I'm hoping that as we go through these things together, that you will have some that you can share with me. You can say, this I've done and this works for me. I would love to be able to try them myself or perhaps in the future share them with others. Like they say in sports, you always miss a shot you don't take. And so we always need to keep trying. We need to put as many arrows in our quiver to assist us in our own wilderness wanderings. Now, some would argue my process is backwards, that what I've done is consider what advice I've heard or read about, and then look for patterns in the Bible. But I find more ways than not, even when we consider contemporary ways of expressing or understanding how we deal with things in our nature, there's nothing new under the sun. That what we see from thought experts is something that's already been done. And so what we have before us are two sides of a coin. Bad habits that we want to change or get rid of, and good habits that we want to form. And they obviously are mutually exclusive. They're not related one to another. One is one and one is the other. But what's interesting is the way that we can either prevent a bad habit or form a good habit is actually based on the same kind of idea. And that is to focus on the cues, to drill down and identify those things that would distract our attention, for good or bad. For bad habits, we want to make those cues invisible. Whatever those triggers are, we want to try to make it very difficult and put obstacles in the way to make them invisible. But for good habits, we want to make them visible. And so, did God do this for the Israelites? Absolutely. In Exodus 12, and maybe just for the sake of time, we won't turn this one up, but in the 7 days leading up to the sacrifice of the lamb and the slaying of the firstborn in Egypt, this is the time of the Passover. God instructed his people to remove leaven from their homes. He says, on the first day, you shall remove leaven from your houses. And as we see, leaven is very much like a cue. It's that sight, it's the smell, it's the sound, the emotion, it's the feeling that can draw us away. And just like leaven, if it's left in the flour, it begins to react. And when it reacts, it permeates the dough and causes it to rise. It changes the nature of the dough. And so God is trying to instill a principle as we have to remove leaven completely from your home to truly prevent its effects. And of course, contemporary literature says basically the same thing. If you want to prevent a bad habit, you need to make the cue invisible. And so go back to what you wrote about the habit that you want to prevent. Remember that the habit is a response to the craving. The craving is triggered by the cue. So you have to drill deeper to find out what initiates these behaviors that we have. What is the cue? What is the trigger? What is it that draws us away and distracts our attention? And then, how do we make that invisible? I can't answer that part of the question for you. We all have a bad habit. We all need to look hard at what the cue is. But we need to figure out how to make it invisible. And sometimes it's hard. If it involves the internet, we may not be able to get rid of our computer or a smartphone or disconnect or unplug. But we need to figure it out. We need to make it invisible. Can we create an obstacle that makes it more difficult for that cue to influence our minds? It may involve removing it out of the camp. Even the sin offering, a recognition or admission of sin, in Leviticus says that the entire residue of the animal was taken out of the camp or outside of the camp. Another option to combat cues is to try to modify the response to the behavior, is to lead our minds instantly in a different direction. It's to recognize that when it happens, we need to redirect our attention, but in a way that's positive rather than it's negative, and for it to be a consistent message or response. And again, we do see this idea in the wilderness wanderings. The parallels to this are in Numbers 21, that the people, and actually I'll just quickly turn to that, in Numbers 21 in verse 4, it says that the people journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom, and the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. They've got this time of proving again. They're tired. And again, the people in verse 5 spake against God and said, Wherefore have ye brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. Again, they think it's just so much better to just give up and go back to Egypt. And yet that was a lie. There was no life in Egypt, only death. And so God sent a not so subtle reminder of this in the form of the fiery serpents. And what was the antidote? Well, we know from the record that Moses was instructed to make that serpent of brass and hang it on a pole. And in verse 8 it says, make thee a fiery serpent and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. The command was to redirect their attention. If the fiery serpent, if that cue leading to a craving strikes you, look to the serpent on the pole. And that was what God had put in place for them to give them focus. Of course, we know later they made it a form of idol worship, but the point was he wanted to redirect their attention away from their inclination to go back to Egypt to now look at that brazen serpent on a pole. And the Lord Jesus Christ, as we know, picks that up in John chapter 3. When he says, as Moses was lifted up in the serpent in the wilderness, even so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And so what is an alternate response to a cue that could lead to sin? One that might be an example of the fiery serpent. Well, one could say, well, just simply look to Jesus when we're into these times of temptation, and that even begs the question, how? How is it that we translate a principle into our daily lives? So one suggestion I'd like to put forward is a trigger verse. It's a memory verse that you instantly recall when you feel drawn away by a cue, when it leads to a craving. And how many of us have a trigger verse to combat a cue? How many of us have a trigger verse that combats the cue that we've just identified in the bad habit that we're looking to solve? We should have a trigger verse. If we don't have one, we should think of the one. Think of the cue that triggers that bad habit. What memory verse could you put beside it that would help you combat it? If you can't think of one now, or you can only paraphrase it, we'll look it up later and have that trigger verse in mind. I always think of Nehemiah. It's not necessarily a trigger verse, but in Nehemiah 2, he was afraid to speak to the king. And the king said, well, why is your countenance downfallen? And he quickly says, well, I pray to the God in heaven. Well, we have to remember, this is mid-conversation. This is not a time the king's now waiting for an answer to his question. Well, it could have been a trigger verse, but it certainly was a triggered reaction to a time of stress. In this case, it was to be instant in prayer. The trigger verse is worth trying to develop. When I feel anxious, I always remember Psalm 46:1, and I've mentioned that in an exhortation. God is my refuge and strength. There was a time in my life as a teenager where I was fascinated by tattoos, but I remembered 1 Corinthians 6, verse 19, know ye not that ye are the temple of God? Just something to redirect the mind to get us thinking in a different way. So consider the cue and try a trigger verse. And what about good habits? Did God ever counsel the people to make something visible? Well, absolutely. And in so many ways. We won't go through the list, but we know that there was feasts and pillars of fire and memorials and altars, even fringes on the bottom of their garments, all to remind them that God was there. But God was always putting his word forward in front of the people. In Deuteronomy 11, verse 18, God said, therefore, he said to Moses, take ye my words, therefore shall ye lay up these words in your heart and in your soul, and bind them for a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. In another place in Exodus 19, Yahweh said to Moses, lay up before the people and before the elders of Israel these words which I have commanded you. He wanted to always put things in front of them, even binding his word upon their hand and upon the frontlet of their eyes, to consider all the ways that God has tried to be in front of his people. He wanted them to think of him first and not Egypt. So what cue can you put in place to form a good habit? They say to eat more fruit, put a bowl of fruit on the counter. The university increased the consumption of water by 30%. And they didn't say anything, no posters or anything. They just put it in coolers, they put it on the checkout counter, they encouraged consumption by 30% by just making it more visible. And so what can you do to make it more visible? Well, we said one tactic is to make it more accessible. Put the fruit bowl on the counter. But if you want to think more spiritually, where is the Word of God in your life? Where is the Word of God in your home? Is it readily available? As Christadelphians, I've seen plenty of good evidence of brothers and sisters making the Word more visible in their lives. But as an exercise, I'd like you to do something after class, and I call it the Word Audit. How many rooms in your home do you have a plaque or a banner or a picture with a Bible verse on it? Or maybe a picture of, reflecting a Bible image. And I'd say count every room except for maybe closets. Go around and make a mental note and write down the verse if you want. But at least contemplate the verse. Find it and say, how does this verse encourage me? And are there any rooms where the Word of God is missing? Any rooms where you don't have it in front of you? And if you want to extend the audit, is the Word of God in your car? Is the Word of God outside? Just as a habit, I've tried to just make a note of a little Bible verse and carry it in my wallet. And do you have a Bible verse in your wallet or in your purse? So one last thing about the Word Audit, and I've found this myself. I've discovered a plaque on the wall or a picture, and I've read the verse and say, I don't remember seeing that for a long time. If you don't remember seeing it when you look for it, move it. Because again, as creatures of habit, sometimes we can make the visible invisible. And I think that's very much what God had in mind when he kept moving the camp. You see, he wanted to prevent the people from literally losing sight of what was placed before their face. And so, there is one other thing that I wanted to just quickly and maybe we might review this again at the beginning of next week's class, because I realize I'm already running out of time. But this is a habit-forming behavior that I have found extremely helpful. And I don't want to skip over this because for myself personally, this has actually worked. And it's called stacking habits. It's a real simple idea. Stacking a habit is actually building on something you already do. It's something that, we have tens or hundreds of habits. And so to build the repetition necessary for a habit to be ingrained, we first start with something that we already do, and then we stack that habit or behavior on top of it. So as a lifestyle example, I've always had an issue taking my vitamins. The turning point for me was when I considered this idea of stacking habits. I realized that every morning I went to the same cupboard on the same shelf at the same time. And all I did, literally, was just move the items to that location. So now, at the same time I went to get what I was getting on that shelf, I also got my vitamins. On a spiritual level, how we've applied this in our lives was a desire of my wife and I to be more consistent in our prayer life. And we also wanted to do this as a couple, not just individually. And so when we reflected on this, we realized that there was always a moment just before we got out of bed. It was usually either the alarm turned off or it was that last sip of coffee. But there's always a moment when we then, before we started our day, we decided that would be the time to insert prayer. And so the stacking of the habit was to pause and to pray together as a couple prior to stepping out of bed to start our day. And before we got preoccupied by the things of life. And it's made a huge difference to how we start our day. It strengthens us as a couple and in our walk before God. And I think this was very much the idea of Deuteronomy 6. We will always battle our nature, even after baptism. We all experience these habit loops of cue, craving, response, and reward. Our sin response is when we're drawn away by and lust is conceived. But we need to make the cue of a bad habit invisible. We need to remove the leaven. We need to redirect the cue of a bad habit. We need perhaps a trigger verse. We need to make the cue of a bad habit or good habit visible, like a word audit. And we need to stack our spiritual habits in our daily lives. And so your homework then is select that bad habit that you want to eliminate. Identify the cue and find ways to make it invisible. Also, select a good habit that you want to form. Identify that cue and make it visible. We need to find and memorize trigger verses for bad habits. We need to complete a word audit for our home. And is there a current habit that you can stack a new good habit onto? So maybe I'll leave that up there, and God willing, next week we'll see how well you've done, and we'll consider the rest of our considerations.